Thank you everyone for being on today. I know we had over 500 people registered for this webinar and likely have less than that are actually on live with us, but definitely speaks to the importance of this topic. Again, I'm Reid. I've been with the Department of Agricultural Economics here at K-State for a little over 9 years now, so it's been a little while. And you've seen me probably more in the farm policy, farm bill, farm financial management areas, but land values is something that I started looking at really about 4 years ago now with Dr. Michael Taylor. And since she's moved on to Auburn University, I've really taken the lead at looking at our prices here across the state for land values and what is going on in our land market. Another thing that I'm going to be talking about today after I talk about land values is ownership trends. And you probably haven't seen this information before, but as I started looking at land values, what really caught my attention is some non-ag investment we've had. So buyers that are not farmers and ranchers and what their interests are in our agricultural land. So that's the other topic that we're going to be covering today. So some of this in the beginning is going to be a little bit of a review from what Dr. Featherstone did 2 weeks ago. He gave a very good broad overview of the land markets and what direction they're going and what he anticipates for the future. And I'm going to take a little more specific dive into Kansas. But nevertheless, just to kind of set the stage here, in our Kansas land market, we had some farm incomes that have been very strong the last couple of years. I'm going to put some hard numbers to that here in a minute. But we do have some ongoing drought concerns, and our input costs are still remaining high relative to our commodity prices. So that even though farm income is strong, we do have some concerns there going forward. Interest rates obviously increasing. I'm not going to get into this today because Dr. Featherstone covered that quite well 2 weeks ago. And if you missed that, it is on our website, agmanager.info. Inflation, something we're still continuing to look at. Dr. Featherstone covered that some too. Obviously, that is increasing our land values as interest rates are starting to maybe push. I'm never going to say land values down today. What I'm going to conclude with is I think we'll see land values increasing more slowly, which I think is really warranted. We've had a land market on fire here the last couple of years. So interest rates are going to start cooling that down a little bit. But don't get me wrong, I do think land values are going to continue to increase, but just not as quickly because of some of these factors. And then the other thing I alluded to, this non-ag investment into our agricultural farm ground, we know it's adding value to, increasing our prices, increasing our land value, but that's really hard to quantify how much. So we'll get into that a little bit as well. What I want to do first is kind of set the stage. We do know that net farm income is the biggest driver of farm ground, even though we have some of these outside influences. The land market really tends to move with what net farm income is doing or the profitability of the ag sector. So Dr. Featherstone showed this same graph 2 weeks ago, but what I would like to show is just how this correlates to land value increases here in Kansas. So the purple one here is our Kansas Farm Management Association farms, the green one being a number just as a proxy to the aggregate US. And you can see when we had our last run up in land values, it was in this area between 2010 and 2014. We had some really good years of net farm income that were really supporting land values. Now the jump from 2014 to 2015, going from 128,000 in average net farm income for our association farms down to just 6,700 net farm income for a year. That dive was the biggest drop in history of our net farm income in our farms here in Kansas. As you can imagine, that put us in a situation we were quite worried that we'd have a devaluation of our land values going back to possibly the 1980s scenario. But in reality, what happened through those years where we had some very low net farm income, we slowly climbed out of it with some government payment income, is that our land values held fairly steady, only slightly decreasing in some areas during this time. When we hit 2020, that's when we had coronavirus food assistance payments. The end of the year during harvest that fall, commodity prices really ramped up. There was a lot of cash sitting around and our land values just took off. One thing I'll note on that purple bar, in 2021 at 310,000 net farm income was a really, really good year for farmers here in Kansas. So what did that do to land values? The first source of land value information I'm going to talk about is from the National Agricultural Statistics Service. So these are surveys that are done typically about this time every year, and then that data comes out in August each year. Now, the hard thing about looking at land values with this information is that right now we only get one number for the entire state for irrigated, dryland, cropland, and pasture. So as you can imagine, from eastern to western Kansas, one number for dryland cropland in the state doesn't really reflect anybody's cropland, but it does help us to look at trends. The last time they reported something more than a state level value was 2013, and that was just for the 9 crop reporting districts across the state. So that caveat there, this is a good information to look at for trends, but not really specifically to know any particular land values. So what I wanted to show here is just basically how from 2000 to 2010, we are just kind of walking along, slowly increasing in land value, but nothing drastic. And as I showed in net farm income in that last graph, it was really from 2010 to 2014, we saw this big run up in land values. You know, dryland, cropland, 26% increase per year during that time frame. This was where when we were concerned there was a land bubble forming. And like I said, when we dropped off in net farm income from 2014 to 2015, that's when we were afraid that land value bubble would pop. And it didn't. We held steady. Irrigation actually didn't lose on average. Dryland cropland went down about 1.5% per year. Pasture actually kind of still increased a little bit. But overall, it was a fairly holding pattern of land values. Now, when we hit the end of 2020, that's when I was saying we were really positioned to take off. We had those food payments, we had commodity prices increasing, and really Superman took off just after that. And we've seen some run up in land prices the last couple of years that are really going back and even exceeding what we saw from 2010 to 2014. Now, this was presented last time, so I'm not going to go through it too much, but what I wanted to show you is just, again, the increase here in Kansas. This is dryland cropland or combined cropland at 24.5%. That's a larger increase than any other state in the surrounding area. And the same was true on pasture. We had an average value in the state of 1,850 last year, and that was a 23.3% increase over what NASS reported in 2021. And again, none of the surrounding states came close to increasing that amount. Now, we talked about cash rents a couple weeks ago too, so I'm not going to dive into that again, but what I did want to kind of point out as it relates to land values is just the National Ag Statistics Service number again for cash rents at the state level. Instead of seeing that big variation, that big swing like we see in land values, our cash rents have been kind of slowly walking along and, increasing gradually over the long run. But what this does, when you take the value of our land in the state divided by that cash rent from those same surveys, what we've seen for the last 20 years is what you can cash rent that ground for versus what its value is continues to decline. So if you look here on my figure, back in 2000 for dryland crop, you could expect from its value, about 5.6% of its value would be what you would expect in a cash rental rate. If you fast forward to this current year, 2022, that's about 2.2% of its value you could expect in a cash rental rate. Now, pasture land has always been lower, 3.4% 22 years ago. That's now down to about 1.1% of its value is what you could expect for a cash rental rate. So this trend continues to decline. There's another number of things that go into this. I think one of the big things is that when NAS asks these surveys, they're not asking what's the new going market rate for cash rental. It's what's a average rent that you're paying over all the leased ground that you have. So some of these leases could be negotiated every 3-5 years, more than that possibly. And there's other factors affecting that cash rental rate. So we wouldn't expect to see the big swings in it as we do in land values. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, you can expect a less of a cash rental return nowadays than you used to versus the value of the land. So what I want to get into next is looking at our land values across the state using actual sales values. So NAS again is surveys. We get one number for the state. What I've been doing for the last, I guess, 5 years now is taking actual sales value and making a summary book out of it. You'll notice 2022 is not in this picture. It did go to the graphic designer last week, and I was really hoping to have it out before this webinar, but we just had a really big delay in getting the data this year for a number of reasons. So the Kansas Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers and I have been working very hard to get that information out. If you are registered for this webinar, when we publish that book electronically, we will shoot you the link to it. So as soon as it's published, we will let you know. But what this information is, again, actual sales data coming from the Property Valuation Department here in Topeka, from county courthouses all across the state. Now, there's some limitations on this data. The information that I do know when I compile the book, obviously, is what county the parcel was located in that sold, how many acres were in the sale, what mixture of type of ground of it was, irrigated, non-irrigated, pasture, taking any value of improvements off, such as a house or a barn or shed or something on there. And then we try to control first these sales that are going for non-ag use. So traditionally, we removed parcels that are under 70 acres. This year, as we looked at Eastern Kansas, we did include some of those smaller sales as well, if we felt like it was a fair market value and not an inflated market value for non-ag purposes. The things you're not going to see on that list that really do make this complicated, especially some of our areas in Western Kansas, we don't know if there's mineral rights with that sale. We don't know if there's any wind energy leases along with that sale. Sometimes we know if it's a family-to-family sale, and it's not always coded that way, even if it is. There's just a lot of moving parts to this that in the full amount of data, I don't actually get to know. So that makes it complicated. So to start off, before I present you the numbers, I just kind of want to give you a picture of what actual sales data looks like. So this is, I'm not going to tell you what county, but this is actual information that I receive. And if you look here, so my price per acre in 2022 on these sales that occurred in this county was anywhere from $854 an acre to $4,527 an acre. And you can see the mix here of dryland acres, irrigated acres, grass, and the total ag acres of each of those sales. Now, I want to point out this top sale and this bottom sale are really not that different on paper. The amount of irrigated acres versus dry land and the total ag acres within 20 acres of each other. But someone paid $854 and someone paid $4,527. So it is messy when you look at this. There's a likelihood that there was something unique about this sale and this sale that drove them to those amounts. But when the actual book comes out and you get to see the county average numbers, make sure you look at the minimum and the maximum that county experienced as well. And that really gives you a feel for just the spread of sale prices that are occurring even in a single county. You know, obviously there's water quantity issues out in Western Kansas with some of these irrigated sales. There's just, you know, land quality, access, proximity to an operation that somebody really wants the piece of ground. So there's a lot of drivers that I would expect this variability. But just knowing there's an average, that doesn't mean every parcel in that county should be valued at that average. So getting off that soapbox, let's dive into what we actually saw here. And I'm going to start out with sale volume. So these are the last 5 years compared to this year in 2022. And what you'll notice is 2021 was a very big sales volume year. So we had really big high prices, record sales, things going up very quickly, and we had a lot of land on the market. 2022, we've dropped off that just a little bit, but still at 475,000. That's quite a bit higher than what we've seen for the last 5 years. Now, the two regions that really drive our land sales in the state, you would expect Southwest, South Central. They have land sales every year that are consistently, 100,000 or a little bit less in South Central here. The one that is really small each year is Northeast. Northeast is really on its own as far as land values being so much higher than any other region of the state, and very little sales volume actually occurs every year. Now here's my state numbers that you could compare to the National Ag Statistics Service for what is going on across the state. Again, they had non-irrigated and pasture ground increasing about 25% per year. I'm actually seeing over 30% in actual sales data as how much we have increased this year compared to 2021. Most of our peaks before were in 2015, and then we dropped off a little bit, but have since well recovered and exceeded what those peaks were in 2015 with our 2022 values. Again, one number for the state doesn't reflect anything but a trend. But as you can see, our non-irrigated crop ground is approaching an average of 3,000 per acre in my numbers, and pasture and hay, really $2,700. Most of our pasture and hay ground is sold in the Flint Hills area. So if you think that's kind of high, that's because that's a lot of the area that sells pasture and hay ground. The irrigated number is a little interesting, and I'm going to dissect that right now. So at the state level, it's actually showing a decrease or really not much of a change. But what's driving this is that really we have 4 regions in the state that have enough irrigated sales to really even look at a trend. And most of our regions here, you'll see, are up 15 to 20%, which I think is probably reality of what's going on out there. Again, this is an average. There's some still record sales out there. But in Southwest, no matter how I crunch the numbers, I'm just not seeing an increase. And Southwest really drives the average. So these are the total irrigated land sale acres that occurred last year. And you can see across the different regions, Southwest dominates all the other regions combined. So that's why it's driving that state number down. But really, what I'm finding in Southwest is there's just so much variability in that irrigated per acre value. As I've talked to appraisers out there and talked to land managers, what's possibly going on, really what I can kind of isolate it down to is there are irrigated sales occurring out there that just don't have the water anymore and probably should have been classified as non-irrigated when it actually sold. There's other things going on out there as well. Again, each sale I don't get to know exactly what the conditions were, but overall, I think the end of the story is there's just a lot of variability, and the average itself didn't show that increase, even though I know there's some very high-priced irrigated ground that's becoming more and more scarce to find out in Southwest Kansas. Now I'm going to run through these a little more quickly. So what I'm going to do is just break down each crop reporting district and what the increase was at the regional level. Again, the county level numbers will be coming out with that land values book very soon. But what I saw here in Western Kansas, most of our regions are up 30 to 40%, especially here in the Northwest, as far as what they were last year. It would have been 2 years ago now, since we're in 2023. But the values from last year really coming up quite significantly, about 2,500 on average of the Northwest, and a little more close to 2,000 per acre when you go further south. When we look at the central regions, again, increases across the board. Here in Central, I didn't pick up near as much of an increase as the other regions. Typically when this happens, it's because one of the lower value counties of that region had some higher sales volume and maybe blended out some of those counties that had a big increase in sales. So I do think we're probably up a little more than 12% even in that central region. But on average, that was the $2,722 was the average dryland crop acre for last year for the sales that occurred. We go to the eastern region, again, northeast is in a graph of its own. We've seen increases in the land values so much more than, the value itself is so much more than the rest of the state. So we're over 6,000 an acre on average in this northeast region. Again, fairly small sales volume in that region though. The other two in this area, obviously seeing big increases too in that non-irrigated crop ground. This region here, a little over 4,000, and then almost 3,500 down in southeast. When we look at pasture and hay ground across Kansas, again, very big increases across the board. The western area is a little less sales volume than the rest of the state. Like I said, we don't have as much as we do in the Flint Hills area that sells every year, but big increases across the board, 1,700 to 1,500 per acre being the average in those regions. If we look at central, kind of a consistent increase across the board, 2,550 down to 2,400 for these two regions. And again, when we look back to the peak in 2015, we're well exceeding what that peak was back then. Now, if we look at the eastern region, I kind of sound like a broken record by this point in my slides. Again, we're up about 30%. Northeast leading the way, 4,500 per acre on average for our pasture and hay ground, dropping off a little bit from there as we go south. But the interesting thing about these areas is just how much urban influence there is probably on these sales, that it's hard to know what is a agricultural use sale and what's more of a recreational sale in these areas. So to really summarize this up and all of the information I just presented, I don't think it's a secret to anyone that land values were up significantly last year and in 2021. Net farm income, in my opinion, being the biggest driver of that increase. Inflation is also part of that, and then outside investment. I do continue to think values are going to rise through 2023. I don't think we'll see a 25 to 30% rise again. There's nothing sustainable about increases of that amount. Farm profitability cannot sustain that amount. So I think even though it benefits a farmer's net worth and balance sheet to have those higher land values, really what's better for agriculture is a steady increase and not these big run-ups like we've seen lately. We're concerned on input prices and commodity prices going forward. If you were here 2 weeks ago, you probably saw the projections of net farm income dropping off the next couple years. And then higher interest rates. I do think there's a lot of cash out there still, and some of the sales that we're seeing that are still very high are being paid for with cash. But this interest rate is going to start coming into play more and more as we go forward. So to summarize it up with my little guys here, I think Superman is going to go back to more of a walking pace when we talk about land value increases. I don't think we're going to be going back to real slow or uncertain increase in the next year, or even probably the year after that. So when I started looking at land values, I do like to attend land sales and things that are going around our area and just kind of know firsthand what's going on with the land market. And something I've seen personally, and as I've talked to real estate agents across the state, is obviously not just in our local area, but we're seeing a lot of land sales being purchased out of state, primarily what seems like for hunting and recreational purposes. And I do feel when I was looking at land sales information, I wanted to see if I could actually quantify, is that something, a trend we're seeing, or is that something that we just witness and seems like is going on? So what I was able to get, and so this would be for 2015, is a database of the landowners in Kansas that own over 40 acres that are ag use classified. So this is 95% of all of our ground in Kansas. Now, don't be afraid, I don't know anything. If you're a landowner, I don't know your name, I don't know your address, anything like that. But I do know the city, state, and zip code that the tax statement is going to of the person who owns that farm ground. And what I did with this is just look at how many of those zip codes are here in Kansas versus out of state. So interestingly, I found about 84.5% of our ag ground here in Kansas does have a zip code of the owner here in Kansas. 15.5% of those those total acres are owned outside the state of Kansas, and this was back in 2015. I also looked at the landowner live in the same county as their parcel. That was about 25 or 55%, and then about 45% no. Obviously, some landowners and farmers farm across county lines, so that's a little bit of a proxy number, but just to kind of give you a taste of what that is. The most interesting thing I found in looking at this was 84.5% again owned by people here in Kansas. I would have expected on that list the next states to be our bordering states, but Texas is by far number 2 on the list. 2.6% of our ag ground here in Kansas is owned by landowners in Texas. And then from there, we go to the bordering states, and then some of these others you see at the bottom. I also looked at what are the percentages of landowners that live in the county. So 91% here in Riley County live within the state of Kansas. As we get some of our bordering counties, less of our landowners live in the state of Kansas, as we would expect. This is a resource also on Ag Manager. If you go here, it's the top one on that list right now, but you can look at each county in the state of Kansas. And here it'll tell you, we got Atchison County pulled up here. 91.8% of the landowners in Atchison County live in Kansas. Of those 8.2% that don't, they're in Missouri and Texas, and then it drops off from there. 24.6% of the landowners that live in Kansas live outside of Atchison County, and they're in Jefferson, Jackson, Brown County primarily. Again, this information is for each county in our state. Just to compare that with a Western Kansas county, here's Decatur. 80% of the land in Decatur County is owned by Kansas residents. Of the 20% that's not, you can see Nebraska and Colorado making up most of that. Of the ones that live in Kansas but not in Decatur County, so about 30%, they're in Sheridan, Norton, Ellis, Thomas, Rollins, and then it drops off from there. So I think this is just interesting to look at the demographics of your county and who your landowners are. Now, my hypothesis was we're changing to having more owned outside our state than we do now. And so what I was able to obtain was most of this data set for 2022. I had a number of counties here that I didn't get information from, but I feel very confident in the set that I do have. So what I did is took the parcels and matched them up. And if the landowner zip code in 2015 didn't match the zip code in 2022, then I tagged that as a parcel that had changed over that 7 years. So basically when I say change though, there's a number of things that could have happened. In the roughly 40 million acres that I was studying, 25% of that had changed in those 7 years. So land could have been sold, it could have been inherited, and that tax statement went to a different person, or the landowner moved, didn't actually sell the parcel, but just relocated. So that was about 9.8 million acres across the state that had changed in those 7 years. If we just look up at the makeup of those acres, 71% were owned by people living in Kansas back in 2015, and that changed last year to about 68%. So we're seeing a small increase in the amount of acres that are owned outside of Kansas now than we did even 7 years ago. When I looked at what type of ground this is, it really did kind of support my hypothesis that this is really primarily in pasture ground or ground that has hunting potential. Of the 3.7% that changed, grass acres were really driving that at about 5% versus 2.6% in our cropland acres. So where is that ground going? Well, Kansas landowners are decreasing. What is increasing is Texas and Colorado. And then the rest of them are kind of mixed. So you can see like Nebraska gained 32,000 acres at the same time as Missouri lost 28,000 acres of Kansas ground. So you can see the top states here, how they've increased and decreased. And then I noted here some other states that have increased ownership of Kansas farm ground and some notable decreases in Kansas farm ground. So with that, I know I've seen some questions coming in the chat here. Foreign holdings is going to be Dr. Featherstone's topic coming up here. So I will address these questions for a little bit before I turn it over to him. So first question here, when you calculate the rent to value ratio and then weight that against lease durations, do we know anything? End of the day story is I don't know the duration of the lease. So when NASS does their surveys, and if somebody from NASS is on here, they can correct me if I am not quite right on this, but basically they're asking you to pick one representative lease for your farm and fill out the survey based on that lease. That is likely not a newly negotiated lease, or, it's more of an average lease for your operation. So, end of the day, I don't know the duration of that. The land value index, I believe, and Rich, you can maybe help me on that. That should still be on our website somewhere. I think under land values, that's something that Dr. Terry Griffin has a tool on and still looks at on a year-to-year basis. So basically what that is you can put whatever year as an index 100 and then compare that. Say we compare 2000 to 2022. If 2000 was an index of 100, what is 2022? And then you can apply that to your own piece of ground. So if you bought it, say in 2000, you can see how it would increase in value based on how the state has increased over that 22 years. So Rich, if you want to drop that in the chat, that should be that tool that Terry Griffin has under our land leasing section. I believe he has it updated for 2022. That was the number that came out in August. So, and Dr. Taylor was part of that publication. Yeah, good question, Dan. What is the proportion of irrigated farm ground in Southwest Kansas that may be misclassified? I think you're probably more knowledgeable than I am on what that value could be. I don't think 10 to 15% is, I think that's definitely in the ballpark as far as what some of that irrigated ground probably should be classified as dry land because of the water issues out there. So thank you for kind of asking that. And I'm going to say you're probably correct. There's quite a few others here. Is there any way to differentiate land sales between connected parties and those unconnected, such as an outside investor? So when I get a look at a parcel sale, it has one number that kind of tells me some things about it. Some of those are, it was an unverified sale, it was a verified sale, it was an absolute auction with limited people there or abundance of people there. One of those codes is a family to sale. Oh, another one is multi-parcel. So they only get one code. So what I think is going on is a lot of family to family sales, when they have to code it as one thing, it maybe gets coded as just a verified sale or a multi-parcel sale. And the fact that it is a family sale just doesn't actually get through on the data that I receive. So I could look at what gets coded as family sales versus the normal population of sales, but I think that family sale number would be very low compared to reality. When I look at this data every year, it brings to mind a phrase that I use with my children, and that is, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. So the fact that we even have this information to look at and report averages at the county level across our state is very unique, and we feel very privileged to work with Kansas Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers to have that information. Even with the shortcomings that it has, it is still very good information compared to other states. Okay, I think I got most of the questions here. If I didn't get to yours, why don't you hold it for a little bit and we'll have some more question time at the end.
And Robin, Doug Bounds from USDA NASS is on. I didn't catch the question. He wasn't sure exactly, but if you want him to reference anything there, you could.
Well, he didn't correct me if I said it wrong, but basically what I was referring to is when National Ag Statistics Service sends out the surveys for land values and cash rental rates. The question was more my understanding of how they ask for what's your cash rental rate is you're picking kind of an average rental arrangement for your farm and filling out that information, because we know most farmers have multiple arrangements with different landowners.
Hi, Robin. This is Doug. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Doug.
That's pretty accurate. Yeah, we're looking for whole operation rental rates, an average across the whole operation.
So that would include rents that are newly negotiated and ones that haven't been negotiated in a number of years. End of the day story.
And it will also include rentals to, say, family members. You know, sometimes we see that happens, and so they're a generous rental rate for that producer.
And I maybe don't want to say this with Doug listening to it, but I do also know that there's maybe a little bias in reporting some of those numbers that I'm saying don't do this. But we do know that farmers are a little bit concerned as they report these numbers that landowners see that in a report and think that it's going to increase rental rates. So again, there's probably a little bias in that reporting, but I really encourage that is great information and to really fill it out honestly. Last question here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Featherstone. Curious if there's any legislative discussion regarding more transparency or less transparency in sales data. I don't know that there's anything going on right now at the state level. You know, you are free to go to your county courthouse and look up historical sale information. I know comparable sales are something that people like to look at, and that is information you can find at your county courthouse.